Hello and welcome to topic 7, lecture 1. And in this topic, we're going to be looking at issues in policing. So what are we going to be taking a look at in this lecture? Well, first we're going to look at the challenges and obligations of policing in a democratic society. Next, we're going to explore who the police are. And to look at that, we're going to first take a look at the relationship between federalism and law enforcement in the United States. We're going to look at the organization of law enforcement in the United States. And then we'll take a look at the demographic composition of the police in the United States. And so let's go ahead and get started. Well, it almost goes without saying that it's a crucial time to be studying policing in America. In the last year, we have seen that criminal penalties have been leveled at police officers for illegal practices. The photos there, obviously George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, the officer who killed George Floyd, was found guilty of unintentional second-degree homicide and received a sentence of 22 years. The lower photograph is a picture of two of the three officers who were with Derek Chauvin. They were recently found guilty of violating George Floyd's civil rights and denying him medical treatment, which is a significant penalty, and they have yet to be sentenced, but I won't be surprised if they receive a relatively stiff penalty. And, Kim Potter, you might recall that she was the police officer who used her gun instead of a taser, and she received a 2-year sentence. So all of those are examples of sort of the increasing seriousness with which the United States is taking police who act in an illegal manner. We're also seeing, potentially as a response to some of the protests around policing in the United States, we're seeing an increase in resignations and retirements among police officers. Between 2020 and 2021, we saw a 45% increase in the number of retirements and about a 20% increase in the number of resignations. We're not exactly sure what is contributing to that. It could be, sort of attitudes towards police might be affecting police and thinking about them not wanting to continue with a job. It could be the stresses of pandemic, but we are seeing a reduced police force. And then we're also seeing that public opinion shows an increased concern when it comes to racial inequality and policing. For example, in a Pew Research Center poll that was done in 2014, that at that time in 2014, 32% of Americans said that police departments did an excellent or a good job in treating racial and ethnic groups equally. Today, only 1 out of 5, or about 20% of Americans, think that police treat people equally in terms of race and ethnicity. So there are a lot of challenges that are facing police officers and police departments and policing in general in the United States, all making it a great and important time to continue with our studies of the policing. Okay, so let's turn our sights to the challenges and obligations of policing in a democratic society. It's a lot easier to fight crime in an authoritarian system. And why is that? Well, an authoritarian system is the kind of governmental system where the government has no real limits on their power. So if you've been paying attention to the war in Ukraine and the coverage that Putin's Russia is getting right now, you probably get a pretty good sense that Russia is an authoritarian country. Putin can do whatever he wants. There are very few limits on his exercise of power. So it's a good example of an authoritarian system. China is an authoritarian system. North Korea, probably authoritarian, probably, better labeled as a totalitarian system. And so it's easier to fight crime in an authoritarian system because the state, the government, can do whatever it wants. There may be a constitution and laws, but it's not followed by the government. If they break the laws, there's no real consequence for doing that. And those who are accused of crimes, and even beyond that, just citizens in general of an authoritarian system, that they do not have any significant freedoms. They don't don't have rights. They don't have civil liberties that are respected. And so it's easier to fight crime because the state can use whatever force it wants to use in order to crack down on criminals. They can bust into your house. They can search without a warrant. They can charge you, try you, and punish you with no restraints. Okay, and so it's a lot easier to fight crime in an authoritarian system. However, nobody wants to live in an authoritarian system. At least that's the argument that democratic societies are making today. And hopefully it will be a forceful argument that will win in the battle of ideas. And so it's a lot more difficult to fight crime in a democracy. Why? Well, because in a democracy, you have a constitution and that you are governed by the rule of law. So the government cannot do whatever it wants. If it does, it's not a constitutional democracy. On the flip side of that, it's important that the people who live in a constitutional democracies have certain liberties, freedoms, and rights that the government must respect. There are restraints that are placed on the power of government to basically, they can't search you in whatever way they want, etc. So it's much more difficult to fight crime in a democratic society. However, we have to fight crime in all societies, right? And most importantly, in a democratic society. A democratic society is based on a social contract where the people who are governed, they provide their consent to be governed. And one of the consents that they give is that they say that they will abide by the rule of law, that they will follow the social contract. And the social contract is important because it's basically saying that these are the important rules of our society. You will follow those rules. And if you don't, then you basically give the government power to punish those who violate the social contract. I tell my students all the time that, it doesn't matter how many liberties you have in the Bill of Rights, but if you're too afraid to walk out your front door and you're fearing for your life, then you're really not living in a democratic society because you cannot exercise those rights without a fear of your life being jeopardized. And so it's important to protect the social contract. It's the implicit agreement among members of society to cooperate for social good, and that those who do not follow the rules, that they can be punished. But to protect the social contract and to punish those who violate the social contract, we must protect the social contract and violate the offenders of it in a way that doesn't violate the values of democracy, right? So we fight crime, we protect the social contract, we punish those who violate the social contract, but we have to do it in accordance with the Constitution, with the rule of law, that those who are law enforcement have to follow the rule of law, that there has to be due process that's followed when somebody is being convicted of a crime, and that there are certain individual liberties that have to be protected. So it's a challenge that is hard to live up to at times, but it's a necessary challenge. It's a necessary burden that we have to realize, or else our democratic society will erode. So what role do law enforcement play as an essential component to a democratic society? Well, law enforcement really are at the forefront of protecting the social contract. They're the ones who make the initial contact with a violator of the law. They investigate violations of the law. In other ways, they investigate violations of the social contract, and they apprehend those who offend that contract. And so, like I said on the last slide, it's important that we maintain the social contract and hold those who break the social contract accountable. And law enforcement are at the forefront of protecting the social contract. Law enforcement are also granted a tremendous amount of power in order to achieve that goal. And in fact, they are allowed to even use lethal force when apprehending individuals who have gravely violated the social contract. However, and they are also granted a lot of discretion to do their job. In our later lecture today, we're going to be talking about how that a lot of the decisions that law enforcement make are known as low visibility decision making. They have a lot of discretion to do their job. There's not a lot of on the ground oversight of law enforcement doing their job. And so that in a way, it's good that we give law enforcement that discretion. However, that discretion needs to be exercised in a way that protects the social contract, that does not violate the rights of the citizens that are a party to that social contract. So law enforcement must be reasonable in the way that they do their job, that they, obviously have to follow the rule of law in terms of engaging in reasonable searches. Their actions have to be proportionate. And so, like with Derek Chauvin, somebody who's arrested for, having a fraudulent $20 bill, you don't kill that person for doing that, right? That's disproportionate and illegal. But that sometimes it is, the use of force is proportionate, and it needs to be proportionate if it's going to satisfy the mandates of a democratic society. And the actions of law enforcement need to be within the bounds of civil rights and civil liberties. And as we saw with the law enforcement who were just recently convicted, they violated George Floyd's civil rights, and they'll be held accountable for it. And so that law enforcement are faced with the extraordinary challenge that makes it difficult but essential to the maintenance of democracy. They have to uphold the social contract and hold those who violate it responsible, but they must do their job in a way that is a reflection and lives up to the democratic values of the rule of law, limited government, and respect for the rights and liberties of individuals. Okay, so let's now talk about who are the police. And to understand who the police are, in particular how the police in the United States are organized, you have to know about the issue of federalism, and we have to be able to talk about what federalism is. So federalism is basically a way of dividing power within a country. So you have a country like the United States, and it has the national government, and it has state and local governments. And then we have to ask ourselves where the question we ask is, well, who should have the most power within that country? Should the national government have most of the power? Should the states have most of the power? Or should it be more of a division of power between the national government and the states? And that's the Constitution that was created in 1787 in Philadelphia. That was a key principle of how our Constitution is organized. Basically, coming out of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, they said, look, we don't want all the power in the hands of the states. That's how we had it at our founding, starting in 1776. But we really want to have a more robust national government, but we want to make sure that there's a power sharing relationship between the states and the national government. And that's what federalism is. Federalism is it's in the Constitution. It's a constitutional division of power between the national governments and the state governments. In our Constitution, federalism is enumerated. It's defined within that power sharing relationship is outlined in our Constitution. And in our Constitution, there are certain powers that are given exclusively to the national government, such as the power to declare war, the power to raise an army, right? There are all these the power to regulate interstate commerce, right? There are all these specific powers that only the national government can engage in. And then the Constitution also tells us that there's certain powers that the states are forbidden from engaging in, such as treaties. It's basically saying states cannot, create treaties. States can't, issue titles of nobility. Okay, so the Constitution says states, you can't do these things. And then, any power that's not given exclusively to the national government or that's forbidden from the states from engaging in, the rest of the power is reserved to the states. Okay. And that is what's known as the reserved powers. We get that in the 10th Amendment. Sorry to get all political sciencey on you, but this is a class in political science. But the rest of the power that's reserved to the states is known as the police powers. And the reserved powers are outlined in the 10th Amendment. So you can take a look at the 10th Amendment to get the actual language of this. And basically what the police powers are, those are reserved to the states. Those are powers that are usually exclusive to the states. And it's states who get they have the power to regulate behavior and morality. And it's that regulation of behavior, and I guess morality to a certain degree, that's a lot of what criminal law revolves around. And so it's really up to states to define what behavior is prohibited, what kind of immorality is prohibited, and then they make criminal statutes around that, and then they empower law enforcement to basically hold people accountable who engage in those prohibited behaviors. And so when we think about federalism is a reflection, is reflected in the different agencies of law enforcement in the United States. There's certain kinds of crimes that are exclusive to the federal government. There are other kinds of crimes, criminal statutes that mostly the states have control over, and that we see that those interests and those differentiations of power are embodied in the different law enforcement agencies within the United States. Okay, so we spent time learning about federalism, that division of power between the national government and the state governments, because federalism organizes our law enforcement agencies within the United States. And so in the next few slides, we're going to take a look at how the major sort of outlines of the federal law enforcement agencies, the state law enforcement agencies, and then county and local law enforcement agencies. So let's start with the federal law enforcement agencies. So, as the name sort of suggests, that federal law enforcement agencies enforce all federal law and protect U.S. citizens, okay? And so, as we know from taking this class, the vast majority of criminal law is left to the states. It's reserved to the states. On the previous slide, we talked about the 10th Amendment and the reserved police powers. So the vast majority of laws having to do with murder and, sexual assault and robbery and theft, I mean, the vast majority of those criminal laws come from states. And if you are charged with violating those kinds of laws or engaging in those kinds of criminal acts, you're most likely going to be prosecuted at the state level. That being said, there are federal crimes, that some of the most common federal crimes that, so when you think about federal prisons and who's doing time in federal prisons, that they usually have to do with drug crimes. And so there's the Controlled Substance Act, which is a federal law that outlines, that people who engage in distribution, possession of these controlled substances are violating federal law. So the vast majority of people who are in federal prisons are there for drug crimes, gun laws, because we have federal gun laws, white collar crime. And so that's the kind of crime that deals with fraud and, usually either some sort of financial fraud having to do with the, the financial markets, or fraud that uses the mail or uses wires to engage in that kind of fraud, and sex crime. Those are the most common sorts of federal crimes. And they all sort of have a link back to the purview of the federal government. And so when it comes to drug crimes, not only do we have the Controlled Substance Act, but oftentimes drug crimes take place between borders. So while you could be charged with a state level drug crime, that most drug crimes have to do with the transportation of drugs between state lines or between borders. And same with sex crimes, such as sex trafficking, a federal offense. Federal, law enforcement is bound to enforcing federal law. Most of the federal law enforcement agencies are housed in the United States Department of Justice. And so we have the legislative branch, we have the executive branch, and that we have the judiciary. And law enforcement are a part of the executive branch because basically they're putting into action laws. And there are many different federal departments, such as the Department of State and the Department of Health and Human Services. And one of those departments is the United States Department of Justice, the DOJ, as often referred to. And the head administrator of the Department of Justice is known as the Attorney General of the United States. And right now, the Attorney General of the United States is Merrick Garland. His name might be familiar because he was put forth to replace Justice Scalia on the Supreme Court, and the Republicans, under the leadership of Senate Majority Mitch McConnell, refused to hear his nomination. He was nominated by President Obama. And so within the United States Department of Justice, there are three major law enforcement agencies. One is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The other is the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. And then the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And so the FBI is, investigates crimes, investigating whether or not federal law has been broken. And as the other two agencies suggest, the DEA obviously focuses on drug crimes, and the BATF focuses on firearms and other laws that stem from the federal government regarding explosives, tobacco, and those sorts of things. So now let's turn to state law enforcement agencies. State law enforcement agencies enforce state law, and they come in two main varieties. One is the state police, which generally enforces state laws and have broad police power. So you do have state police. And again, for states, it's going to be different. Each state is going to have their own sort of structure. And in a second, I'll talk about Wisconsin's state law enforcement agencies so you get a better sense of the specifics in Wisconsin. So it depends on what state you live in. But broadly, you have the state police that have these broad police powers to enforce state criminal law. And then you have state patrols, or highway patrols, which are mainly focused on traffic enforcement on the state highways and the interstates. Okay. And so, when it comes to law enforcement, you sort of have the general state law enforcement, and then you have the other law enforcement that is specific to highways and interstates. Just like at the federal level, Wisconsin has a Department of Justice, and there are different law enforcement agencies that are housed within the Department of Justice. One is the Division of Criminal Investigation. And so the Division of Criminal Investigation, there are agents, DOI agents, special agents that work for it within that division. And they usually investigate crimes that have sort of a statewide implication. So, for example, there might be a crime that's going on that's not just affecting certain jurisdictions, like certain cities where that crime is more prevalent, but it might be broader kinds of crimes. And so, the state might be, in Wisconsin state's Division of Criminal Investigation focuses on human trafficking within our state, and there's overlap there between the state law and the federal law, obviously. That internet predation is something that the Division of Criminal Investigation looks at, and also the opioid crisis that's going on, not just in our state, but in other states as well. But those are sort of the examples of the kinds of investigations that the Department of Criminal Investigation would be involved in. And then internships that are available there. If you're interested, you could look into those. And then within the other division within the Department of Justice is the Division of Law Enforcement. And what that division does is that it keeps the crime information for the entire state. And so you can look to the Crime Information Bureau to get an idea of how much crime is taking place in Wisconsin. I mean, you can also, look at the Uniform Crime Report to get that as well, but they collect data. And they also run the State Crime Lab, which you might have heard about recently in the news, because there has been a backlog in the past on the State Crime Lab, that you have crime kits, particularly rape kits, that are sitting and not being properly evaluated. They're just sort of like, there's not enough people power to do that. And so one of the goals in the last couple of years has been to increase sort of the productivity and the efficiency of the State Crime Lab, which I think is being achieved. And then, so that's the Department of Justice, but the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, they're in control of the law enforcement as it relates to state patrols. And so those are just some examples of how law enforcement plays itself out at the state level, in particular the Wisconsin level. All right, and now let's look at local law enforcement, county and municipal law enforcement agencies. And the podcast that you're going to be listening to this week is it's a podcast called this from a show called This American Life, and the podcast is called Cops See It Differently. And you're going to be doing a discussion and applying concepts during the discussion. And so that podcast is about the Milwaukee Police Department, a good example of municipal law enforcement agency. The vast majority of policing takes place at the local level. And so most of our resources are spent on providing dollars for local police officers and also county members of the county sheriff's office as well. And so, you have Milwaukee Police Department, you'll have Milwaukee County, you'll have the Waukesha Police Department, the Washington Police Department, and then you'll have the Waukesha County and the Milwaukee County as well. And so county law enforcement officials are what that's known as the sheriff departments. They enforce state laws and county ordinances. So like in the summertime, I live in Milwaukee, and so in the summertime, you'll oftentimes see the sheriff's department down at the lakefront, and that they're there patrolling because the beaches and the parks are part of a county system. And so that's an example of the role that county law enforcement will play. They will also be involved in the monitoring of the roads in the county with it as well. And another thing that the sheriff's department does or is handled at the county level are county jails. So while we're not going to be talking about county jails until we get to the corrections unit later in the semester, you should keep that in mind in terms of that the House of Corrections, in Milwaukee County, I think it's in Franklin, that is controlled and peopled by the sheriff's department in Milwaukee. City police are the most common type of law enforcement officials. If you have contact with the police, the chances that of that contact coming from the city police, the municipal police, those are the cops that you're going to have the most contact with. Second, being pulled over with, on the highway from a sheriff's department. But, they're the ones, and you're going to see it play itself out in the podcast. They're the ones who are responding to complaints that they get from neighbors to investigate something. We have shot spotter in Milwaukee. And so if there are shots fired, the police will respond to that, etc. So those are the people that be the boots on the ground. And city police have broad authority to enforce state and local laws. And so they're, enforce local city ordinances as needed. And also local law enforcement will sometimes work with state law enforcement and also federal law enforcement in order to tackle certain sorts of crimes. But anyways, that just provides an overview of that. And you'll get more of a detailed look at that when you listen to your podcast, at least for the Milwaukee Police Department. All right, so let's end here by taking a look at the demographics of the police departments. And there's a lot of information in the textbook, so I'm not going to go over it all, but I just want to touch on a couple of key points. That when we look at the composition of the American police force, it's changed a lot in the last 40 to 50 years. Up until the 1970s, police departments throughout the United States were usually mostly white, that mostly male, having a degree of education that's not anything beyond high school. And also, not that this isn't still true today, but it sort of can be seen as a family tradition. Your granddad was a cop, your dad's a cop, you're going to think about becoming a cop. And we still see that today. But today, the police force is much more diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, more diverse in terms of gender as well. But it's sort of right now about 15% of the police departments throughout the United States, and it's going to be different. Looking at bigger police departments, bigger cities with bigger police departments, smaller. But about 15% of police officers are women, and that's stayed pretty, that hasn't changed a lot over the last decade or so. So maybe that will increase. In fact, I think I was reading that we've actually seen a decline in the number of women police officers. But takeaway is that our police force is a lot more diverse today than it has been in the past, and particularly when it comes to race and ethnicity. And that's because police departments have really made a concerted effort to diversify their police forces. That there is a sense that you have a more a trust in a police department that looks like the people that you're patrolling over. And so there's been a move to have that sort of diversity. And that kind of diversity has been supported by police officers as well, because they also feel like they can do their job better if they have a variety of different, backgrounds and different races and ethnicities within the police department. And so as what we are seeing though recently is that we're actually seeing a decline in the number of Black officers. And so, but there's a couple ways of thinking about that. That one way is we are seeing a little bit of a decline of Black law enforcement who are stepping out of, retiring, resigning. And that we're not sure why, but it may have to do with the protests in the United States. But even more importantly is that the diversity of the law enforcement hasn't kept up with the diversity of the cities that it's representing. And so it's not necessarily that there's been a decline in diversity of the police force, but that the cities that they're patrolling have become much more diverse, and police departments aren't keeping up with that diversity. Departments are not reflecting this diversity, okay? So that you're still seeing this gap in terms of representation. Even though police departments are diverse, they're not as representative of the diversity of the cities. And this is particularly the case for big cities in the United States, of the racial demographics of where they're patrolling. And I put a link there, and I'll try to put it in show notes if you watch podcasts, right? For the New York Times had a great article about which police departments are diverse as their communities, and it kind of gives you a sense of that gap that's sort of growing, and which cities are doing a good job closing that diversity gap. So when it comes to thinking about demographics and the police department, there are a couple of things that your textbook talks about, and I'll let you read it in more detail, but this sort of touches on it. Textbook talks about that diversity in police force matter, and that and we see that reflected in police forces trying to create a more diverse workforce. You're going to see in the podcast that you listen to that Milwaukee Police Department has really tried hard to diversify its police force, but it has not been very successful at doing that. And there are reasons for wanting that that racial and ethnic diversity. One is symbolically, right? If your community is racially and ethnically diverse and your police force is not, that's going to sort of send a certain message that those who are involved in social control are all of one race, and they're implementing that social control over a diverse demographic group within that city. And so symbolically it matters, and studies show that that when you have a diverse police force, people are more likely to have trust in that police force. And that realistically it matters as well. And so that that when you have a diverse police force, in the next lecture we're going to be talking about different police styles. And when you have a diversity in terms of racial background and ethnic background and also gender, that is going to play itself out in the kinds of policing styles that police engage in. African American police officers are in general less likely to pull people over and arrest people. They're just as likely, if not more, to treat African Americans the same as African American people that they have contact with, in the same way that white cops treat African Americans. In fact, there's some studies that show that African American cops are even harsher on African American contexts that they have within the community. But in general, African American police officers are like a little bit more hands-off and are more likely to exercise discretion broadly when it comes to policing. So you have to get different, on the ground in terms of context and who to pull over and when to arrest and when not to arrest. Diversity that gets played out when you have a diverse police force. Make sure that you read about the challenges that minority and women officers face, and that the challenges that minority and women police officers face are really different than those of white male police officers. They talk about double marginality for minority officers. Minority officers think that there's sort of a myth that Black officers are going to be easy on Black criminals, right? And so kind of like so that might explain why black officers actually like crack down a little bit more, because they don't want to live up to that myth. But they also experience racism within the department, and so it's sort of like you feel like marginalized, like under two sorts of, you experience racism, but then also there's like, oh, you're going to go soft on crime because those are your people, right? And then there's a lot of stress associated with that double marginality. And your textbook also talks about the challenging perceptions that policing is masculine, and that assumptions that maybe women police officers aren't up to this masculine task. Obviously, women police officers have proven otherwise, but early on, as women were joining police forces, they were oftentimes relegated to more feminine tasks, like either ticketing and parking enforcement, or like behind the scenes sort of secretarial work. Okay, so anyways, you can read more about that in detail in your textbook. And finally, we're not going to go over this chart in the lecture. I just want to draw your attention to it because they have a really good chart that basically shows the race and ethnicity as it breaks down within law enforcement within law enforcement agencies throughout the United States. All right, thanks a lot for listening. And the next lecture will look at policing styles and police use of discretion. And so you can look forward to that. Talk to you again soon.